Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a political podcast that has written a letter for Theresa May but hasn't received a reply yet. And as always, I'm joined by my co-host Rob. How are you, Rob?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. I had a decent weekend. It's been a bit of a lazy weekend, and that's been nice. How about you?
Yeah, no, I'm good. England have won in the rugby, so I'm absolutely buzzing. We're winning in the cricket as well. And Coventry won. We scored, did a goal. I'm very happy about all those three things. So let's keep the positive vibes through this podcast.
And that's some good sport news. So we'll go straight on into our two positive news stories during Headline Quickfire. Yes, so we have two bits of positive news this week. The first one is football club to educate rather than ban racist fans. And I thought this is quite good because there's a lot of talk these days about when people are a problem in society, like we should lock them up and throw away the key kind of stuff. And I've always been pro re-education where that is suitable. And I mean, obviously, like banning someone from a football club for being racist is not quite the same as throwing someone in prison. But the idea that actually maybe if you actually talk to these people, you might be able to remove the ideas. So that's Chelsea Football Club actually that are doing that. And yeah, so they've had reports of hate speech and anti-Semitism, and now they're making a point of trying to re-educate these fans instead of banning them straight away. I mean, it might not work for everyone, but I mean, I think it's a good idea to at least try.
Yeah, it's an excellent idea. I think usually the blanket response across all football is to just ban the fans, and in particular, sometimes they ban all the fans from the stadium. It happens where there's a lot of crowd trouble and there's a lot of racist chants. UEFA can go that far, and that's usually accompanied by a fine. But a lot of the time, these clubs don't necessarily learn their lesson, and they feel more alienated when they're actually allowed to get back into the stadiums. They just carry on and do it again because they think, we only got a ban. We can all move on from that. So yeah, I hope this move shows some sort of progression within those fans and that it works and that other clubs start to copy it.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it just seems like a good idea. And talking of good ideas, our second bit of positive news this week: charity shops to sell interview outfits for £10. I think that's a good idea. It's 650 UK charity shops have signed up to the Dress to Impress initiative, and they making sure that they can give suits or dresses or whatever, shirt and a nice set of trousers to people for a tenner, so that they can go and then interview for a job, which presumably is going to help with unemployment rates and things like that.
Yeah, it's a lovely idea, and I hear that charity shops are sort of having a bit of a boon at the moment because of the Marie Kondo show about
oh yes,
decluttering.
Does this give me joy? No.
Yeah.
Does this give me joy? Yes.
Precisely. Lots of people are taking their stuff down charity shops, so they've had a massive influx of goods after Christmas in particular. So hopefully there'll be more suits down there, and then more people can get the good suits for their job interviews as well.
Yeah. So now we'll move on into the normal headlines. From The Guardian, fear of hard Brexit pushes 1 in 3 firms to plan move abroad.
Yeah, we've been talking about this for some time, that this prospect of no deal has been hanging over the UK for quite some time, and in particular businesses who have demanded clarity from Theresa May about what her position is. I think after she lost both votes in the House of Commons, she got on to direct conference calls with the business organisations in the UK saying, well, this will be our plan if the deal goes through, and this is our plan now if it doesn't. Now no deal is becoming more and more of a reality as that deadline ticks down. More businesses are looking to have at least an office abroad, and I think that's what this report said. It said 1 in 3 firms plan to relocate at least some of their operations outside of the UK in the event of a hard Brexit, so they can still have some interaction with the EU.
As I say, I'm not a business owner, but I mean I work for a business that is small enough that you do find out about some of these kind of things, and we have. Within the company, there is like a US arm of the company that has existed for years, but it's entirely because if you have like an office with a guy, then posting stuff and all of that to the US suddenly becomes easier. So it's not surprising that firms would be moving something abroad to ensure they had like an EU presence. And it just makes it easier from a taxes point of view, etc. If you're kind of shuffling stuff within your company, even though, I mean, I'm not an expert on like exporting and importing, but it definitely helps basically if you have a foothold in the different markets.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the headline might not be as apocalyptic as it sounds when you dig under it. Like you say, it might just be one man in an office in Brussels somewhere who helps to direct communication between the UK and the EU in the event of no deal Brexit. But it's still quite scary to think that at least 1/3 of companies are having to consider that. That'll be an extra cost. And yeah, as we'll go on to show in one of our other stories later on, it doesn't bode well for the UK economy that a lot of businesses are having to take that move.
Yeah, no, yeah, yeah. You wouldn't want to have to do it, but it kind of seems logical if there's worries of no deal happening. Our next story from the Times: Sunday Times journalist was murdered by Assad.
Yeah, this was the story that happened quite a while ago. The journalist with the eye patch, I don't know if you remember her, Mary Colvin. She was killed in an airstrike by the Syrian government, and now the Sunday Times has effectively been able to sue or claim damages for her murder. They've imposed $300 million worth of damages for the Syrian government to pay up, which is, I think, quite a big sum for the Syrian government, and quite the sort of unusual move by the courts to directly prosecute a government for an action such as this. Yeah, I think that's all I've got to say on the story, really. But it's
And now heading a bit further north for a headline from The Scotsman. Increasingly unlikely UK will leave on Brexit Day, says Minister. So, I mean, the reason I've gone to The Scotsman here is I don't think this was reported on any of the front pages in England during on that day, but I think it probably got some coverage on BBC News and it got mentioned, deeper in the papers. But this is the headline, so I had to go a bit searching to get so we could talk on this point. But there it is.
Yeah, this is the news, and we've been talking about this for quite some time. A lot of people have said when the latest 2 Brexit votes happened, a lot of people said, well, they won't have time to get another vote through Parliament. We're really cutting it quite late. And particularly if the talks that Theresa May has had in the EU this past week haven't gone very well, and she's still unable to get it through. I think the last time the UK could realistically get a date for a vote through and get it done by the 29th of March was Valentine's Day.
So within 4 days away at time of recording.
Yes, and I'll answer your question with a question. Do you feel like Theresa May's ready to propose a deal that will pass through Parliament in 4 days?
I mean, no. Is the short answer. I mean, yeah. I'm not exactly sure what we're talking about later on, but yeah, I mean, I don't think she's ready. I think we've discussed all the issues in the last few weeks, and I don't think much has moved on.
Precisely, and they could. It sounds bizarre, but parliamentarians are a bit like school children in the fact that they go on lots of holidays a year. So it's February half term over in the UK, and that's also when a lot of parliamentarians have their time off, which would again delay the possibility of a vote because the MPs literally won't be in Westminster to have the vote and go through proceedings to get it started. So there has been some talk of delaying that or putting that on hold to get Brexit legislation through. But in the words of this minister, it seems unlikely that will happen. So if we do want to go ahead with a deal, then we will have to look to extend Article 50 and not leave on the March 29th, as was promised. It's, as always with everything, it's a bit of a mess when it comes to Brexit. Nobody's quite sure, and it's really interesting that you say none of the other papers led with it. Which might show that there's some uncertainty within government. Certainly, it would be a massive story if Theresa May was to go out there and say, we can't do it by this time. And I think she's doing a bit of that ploy of, if I don't say it, then maybe it'll just happen. But the clock is ticking on this one. And I think the minister who's commented to the Scotsman is probably like taking a more realistic view of things.
Yeah, and I think there is a bit of that in the papers at the moment. People presenting the best face, but I think most people are starting to realize that a lot of these promises are not being met, etc. So we'll see what happens, but I mean, yeah. I hope it doesn't crash and burn into a no-deal Brexit. So next up, again from the Times, Brexiteers reject EU concession on backstop. So again, this goes back into, is there a viable deal?
So Theresa May went to the EU this week to try and discuss, amongst most things, the backstop. This is the thing that most Brexiteers are really upset about, and essentially outlines that if we are unable to get a workable soft border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, then effectively we will remain within the EU under EU law until we can sort that out. And Brexiteers are really uncomfortable about that because they feel it means Brexit in name only. And also, there's no time limit on this backstop. It could leave us in there for 100 years. So they're really looking to get rid of this. And in particular, what also causes sort of a bigger headache for Mrs. May is the fact that the DUP are really opposed to having this backstop in place. Anything that makes Northern Ireland different to the rest of the company or might threaten the splitting up of the UK and losing Northern Ireland to Ireland, they reject entirely. So Theresa May has gone to the EU and they tried to get a compromise, essentially more of a legal wording and legal framework to say that this backstop won't be indefinite. Not that it won't happen at all, but just to make sure that, you'll leave within 5 years. Brexiteers weren't happy with that at all and pretty much flat out rejected that concession from the EU, saying that they're going to stick to their guns and say, no, we really, really don't want a backstop in this deal at all. That's the one thing that we really can't stand. So things have come to a head now, and again, it puts Mrs. May's deal in jeopardy. If she can't get Brexiteers on board, then it's really unlikely that she can appeal to those crossbench to try and get another deal through Parliament.
Yeah, and I mean, what I said at the start and what we've tied into several times, there's not a deal that's going to please everyone, and that's a problem because she has to get it through Parliament. So there might be a no-deal Brexit. Next story from the Financial Times. Plans hatched in secret to revive economy after a no-deal Brexit. And I see there's a key word there, hatched, so I want to know if we secretly have a dragon.
I don't think so. I wish we did. It might be a boon to the British economy if we had one, at least for tourism. This is the big story that in the event of a no-deal Brexit, as has been widely said by most papers, although most people would say that there's a bit of project fear there, the economy might go very, very bad for Great Britain if we leave without a deal, particularly in the short term. So the Bank of England has hatched in secret a plan which is called let me just get this article. It says it's basically a doomsday list of economic levers we could pull if the economy is about to tank.
Wow! I mean that puts it in no uncertain terms.
Yeah, and those are words from a civil servant who's working on it, and has said they've been working on it since the summer. So it shows that from maybe our point of view, no deal Brexit has become more of a realistic prospect from about summer last year, and now those plans are coming into effect. And there's a couple of economic indicators that are already showing that the economy would really suffer during a no-deal Brexit.
Ties into Times weakest growth in a decade.
This was the story that came along that said that essentially Britain has got 2008 economy numbers.
That's not good. That was recession time.
Yeah, precisely. We're not in a recession yet, but there's a big fear that even if there was a deal, that there's a big risk that the UK could go into recession. Now, that's not just because of no deal. There are some other global economic factors. I know China is underperforming, and there's big worries about the amount of debt the US has at the moment. But if you decide to put another, that's one suitcase of bad. If you put another big suitcase of bad, which is a no-deal Brexit scenario, then the economy really could tank. So they do need something they can do in the short term to at least stave that off. The other big economic indicator is the housing market, which is stagnating and people aren't buying because people are waiting to see what happens with Brexit. Businesses aren't investing in anything because they're waiting to see what happens in Brexit. We are less than 2 months away from leaving from that date. Businesses have to start planning. I mean, it goes to what I said at the start, but with just 2 months to go, that's a sensible time period for most businesses to go, let's just put our spending on hold before we work out exactly where we have to put our finances in the event of a no deal. This is starting, this is creating a weird sort of toxic cocktail of doubt and debt and worry and people not knowing what to do or where to place their money in the economy. So whatever happens, if we leave with a deal or if we don't, that will at least give businesses some certainty about what to do.
From The Guardian, Instagram to ban graphic images of self-harm.
This is the story that followed the tragic death of the 14-year-old girl, Molly Russell. It was found in an inquest into her death that she had viewed some quite graphic images on Instagram that they think may have inspired or at least led her to, have knowledge about how to perform that dreadful act. And in response, Instagram have come under quite a lot of criticism. It's highlighted some other flaws in Instagram's system of what you can type in as somebody who's underage and just come up with pictures of whatever, how their system is moderated, if it's done by algorithms or real people. And this is the first sort of like pressure by legislative moves. Even though there's no legislation in place, Instagram has taken it upon themselves to self-moderate and ban these items from the platform. It's something that's coming up a lot over the internet. I think you'd agree that, places like YouTube and Facebook have already had their queries about what's right to host on their site, and in particular, who moderates that content and decides what goes on there. I think most people would agree that the algorithm is the cheaper way, and certainly the way that YouTube and Facebook would prefer to run things. But a robot is always going to be imperfect and never pick up on things that a human would do at the same time. So we'll wait to see what happens with other companies if they follow suit. But it follows quite a common pattern of the government not having to put legislation in, then putting pressure on a company until they react to make sure the government doesn't have to get involved. But if it keeps on happening, then I think we will sort of see increased government interference in the online marketplace.
I think we've mentioned before, maybe in a silly season episode, we'll talk about like stuff to do with being online, how that affects voting and all sorts. Instagram specifically with this issue, one thing I want to highlight that I can't find the exact headline for now, which is really annoying, should have copied it down. The Daily Mail put up their headline was something along the lines of finally a law to protect the children or something like that. And actually, for once, I found myself in agreement, because we've had a lot of these problems with, like, we have coming in, is it next month? We have this new kind of UK porn law coming in that was kind of voted in ages ago, but took forever to implement because, as people suggested, it would be a real pain to implement. And various other laws that have always been kind of couched in this knowledge, couched in this language of, if you do this, this is bad for children, therefore we're going to stop this. And generally that has been a way of limiting people's rights on the internet, as opposed to actually catching people who are targeting children. And so in general, I'm against those things, like the whole like tracking all of your IP addresses and stuff like that goes on, that seems very Orwellian. And for once, this seems like actually how this should work. It should be, they talk to the company and the company goes, okay, they're going to do all this otherwise. And then they've like made some sensible changes that will hopefully reduce the number of unfortunate events like what happened to that girl you mentioned earlier. Like, and I think for once, I might, it doesn't happen very often, but for once I might be in agreement with a Daily Mail headline, because it seems like actually they've done something worthwhile with this. And normally the MPs, etc., don't seem to understand the internet. And for once, it seems like something good is coming of a bit of crackdown from the government on that. And so our final headline this evening from the Independent Digital: Corbyn sparks Labour civil war over referendum.
Yes, this is the story that, we've been poking at it for some time, that Jeremy Corbyn is walking a very fine line with his Brexit policy, both at one point promoting Brexit and saying that, the Labour Party wants to implement it in their own certain way, while their members seem quite opposed to the idea, or at least really want the chance of a second referendum vote to happen. One of the big things that came out of this week, and I believe you put a link to the story in the Discord group earlier, was about Jeremy Corbyn's letter that he'd sent to Theresa May that outlined Labour's 5 points, what they wanted from a Brexit deal. the hope here was that it would get some cross-party talks going. It might lead him to shape Brexit in a way, and it could provide a path for a deal to pass through Parliament. Essentially, one that is supported by the bulk of centrist, like Labour MPs, and the bulk of sort of the softer Conservatives, not the hard Brexiteers, not the Jacob Rees-Moggs, but the Nicky Morgans of this world, would come together with a much more softer Brexit deal that could pass through Parliament. So yeah, that's the hope. So that sounds like all sunny and nice, and what a great idea. But it's upset a lot of people in the Labour Party, most noticeably Owen Smith, who ran a leadership campaign against Jeremy Corbyn the last time, directly after the result of the Brexit referendum, where Corbyn had his last challenge. And Owen Smith has said that essentially, if this goes through, then we won't have the need for a second referendum. Essentially, Corbyn will have betrayed the members on that vote. It's too pro-Brexity. A deal like this would only help to keep Theresa May in power. Why has he gone and done this? And it's causing a major rift in the Labour Party. We've already mentioned in the last episode about how Labour was worried it was losing quite a few members over their Brexit position, and this again, reinforces the idea that Brexit is now causing a major split within the Labour Party that could cause some MPs to leave.
We've talked about how he's walking this fine line, but it is interesting. At some point, someone has to compromise, or we're getting a no deal, and they're a bit like if we're stuck with having to leave, which I think we've touched on before, like in the similar way to how we talked about Theresa's deal, it was like, this isn't great because we'd like to stay. But if you say that that's no longer on the table, and I honestly feel like it's not, I don't think there is a way we can do it because I don't think there's enough people. Like, we've discussed this before, it was a 50-50 split pretty much down the middle of the country. You're going to annoy at least half of the country, but by not going through with what they see as their side of the deal. So there has to be some kind of middle ground, and it's going to annoy some people, yes, and some people will feel it's a betrayal, but what else can we do other than have a no deal and go down in flames? I'm being, throwing in a bit of a kind of dangerous rhetoric there, I suppose, but, I feel like no deal is so bad that we have to try and do something.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. And having read through the letter, there's a good potted summary that I'll just put in the chat now. That gives you the main 5 points. But Corbyn's Brexit idea is, I would say, incredibly soft. It keeps us in the customs union, which is the one that keeps all of our tariffs the same if goods come. So that's the one where if a car comes from Japan, from France to the UK, the same tariffs are applied throughout wherever it comes in. So it keeps us in there, but it would keep us out of the single market. So the single market is the one where it allows any amount of goods and people to cross borders. So it would be sort of cherry picking at some of the four freedoms that the EUs have outlined. But that's similar to what Theresa May is aiming for in her deal. It also, Corbyn wants dynamic alignment on rights and protections in the UK. So essentially, if trade union laws are one way in the EU, he wants them to be the same in the UK, which is pretty much what happens now. But he wants the UK to sort of have a say and maybe direct EU policy, as well as the UK being influenced by the EU. So it's not just a one-way street, which sounds workable, but again is, it keeps everybody incredibly close to the existing EU policy. And the final 2 points are about security and other EU agencies, like the atomic one. I can't remember the name of it, but there's
Euratom.
Euratom, that's the one. Thank you. Ones like that, the European Chemicals Agency, the European Aviation Agency, and also like security things like, how you can have data protection rules across the UK and how you can indict somebody from the EU to the UK. He wants to keep all of that in place. So it's an incredibly soft Brexit, and one that maybe some Conservatives who were Remainers and are looking for the softest Brexit deal possible would buy, and would almost certainly annoy those hardcore Brexiteers.
I know, wanting to kind of circle back to what we've already said, like I know there are going to be people saying, "Oh, you've betrayed us because the membership want to stay," but I honestly don't think there's a thing you can do that makes that happen. And this seems like the most EU-y we can be. But we're technically out, so you can tell people who wanted Brexit that we're technically out. Which I think for a lot of people, I mean, I know there's the hardcore Brexiteers within the Conservative Party who will never be happy. I don't think they're, but I think a lot of people who voted for Brexit, if you were to ask them, like I think a lot of them would be happy with being some way out, if you see what I mean. Like, if I don't, I mean, maybe this is too soft for them. I can't speak for them, but having some kind of mix of rules like this, if we can get it, because obviously this all relies on the EU saying yes. Something that's a bit soft like that would be better, because we'd be less ruined by a possibility of no deal or like a full on Brexit. So, yeah. I feel like I'm saying the same things over and over again and no one's listening, but I suppose that's how everyone kind of feels about Brexit.
Correct. You've summed up Brexit perfectly in that sentence. And you know what the good thing is? We're going to continue having the same conversations for the rest of our lives. That's my worry.
Yeah.
So yeah, keeping it light.
So talking about the possibility of a civil war within the Labour Party, and we know what last happened when there was a kind of civil war within the Labour Party. We got the Lib Dems, who spun out of Labour in the early 80s. We did a history episode on this, and I've forgotten already.
Yeah, in the form of the SDP, or like Social Democratic Party that that merged with the then Liberal Party. Maybe I'm being too precise, but essentially the Liberals did exist before the Lib Dems, but
yes,
the new party that split out merged with the Liberals to form a sort of new third party.
So that kind of explained, we had Conservatives being right, we had Labour being left, and we had a part of Labour who were a bit more centrist in some ways, who split off, and then they joined with the Liberals, and that's why we got this kind of more central party in the Lib Dems. So with all of that in mind, your question you want to ask tonight is, would a new political party work in Great Britain? So how would a third party come to be? Would it be a spin-off out of Labour again? Because we've also worried about the Conservatives kind of splitting up. And well, yeah, I mean, take it away, Rob. It's your topic this evening.
Yeah, well, what I wanted to do first of all is sort of frame a person who won with a third party candidacy and look at the factors that allowed them to win, and then compare it to what we've got in the UK. So the biggest third party success story in recent times has to be Macron in France.
Emmanuel Macron.
Oui.
Oui.
Yeah, so he came out of nowhere to storm the presidential election, and has been in power ever since. So I just wanted to review the factors that got him into power and compare this with the current situation in UK politics. So the first one I want to focus on is luck. So Macron was incredibly lucky that he came in at a time where all other parties appeared to have a leader in place who was unpopular with vast swathes of the population in some way. So he had those on the left. They had, the social left were very out of touch there. The centre-right parties were dogged by scandal. I think in particular one had sort of campaign finance violations, and then even the one that had some momentum was run by Marie Le Pen, which was an incredibly far-right party in France, and of course had vast swathes of the population against her. So if we compare this to the situation in the UK, so Tom, I'll ask you the question, do you think there's any political party or leader out there at the moment who is sort of like universally liked or seen as sort of a uniting figure in the country?
No, I mean, essentially no. I think all of the main parties have all their baggage. The Conservatives are who they are and have been for a long time. Labour are who they are and have been for a long time. And the Lib Dems had a chance in like 2010, and they're still marred by all of the problems they had where they appealed to students, and I still think they were mostly scapegoated by the Conservatives at the time. But I think that the overall opinion of the Lib Dems is kind of like they had a chance and they screwed it up. So yeah, out of the three main parties, no, I don't think you're going to get the Greens uniting people anytime soon. They have pockets of around the country where they do quite well, but the Greens are kind of seen as too small. And I suppose the other party that I would mention in kind of England, at least, so not the SNP, but the SNP is not going to unite the whole country, is it? it's a one-issue party, essentially. Even though they do good things locally in Scotland, but they're not aimed. The SNP is not going to run in Wiltshire. But yeah, the only other party that is interesting is headed by everyone's favourite person. There's the Women's Equality Party, which popped up after the last general election, and is I don't think they're officially headed by Sandy Toksvig, but Sandy Toksvig is heavily involved. And yeah, I mean, I think that's good. They have objectives of trying to deal with the problems we have in the UK, where there's still, while technically speaking, you're not supposed to underpay women compared to men, and the equality, the pay equality, the wage gap, that's what it's called, isn't it? There is that problem still, because we're not doing enough to fight it. While it may be technically illegal, and you can find someone who does that as a company, it can still happen because wages are hidden and stuff like that. So they're focusing on stuff like that, abortion law, etc. I don't know if a single issue party like that can do more than raise awareness, if you see what I mean. Yeah, I think they would struggle to become the main party in Parliament, but I would like to see some MPs elected from that party to help raise awareness of those issues and maybe get those things changed into law. Because if enough people get voted in, it makes the big parties go, "Ooh, look." But I don't think they're going to be the party that would be this hypothetical third party, unfortunately.
So I think it's fair to say that we're living in an age where it's quite a divisive political landscape, quite polarizing, and there's no unifying figure at the centre. And my evidence for this that I'm just going to post in the chat is this list of Ipsos Mori polls that show the satisfaction with the government and with various party leaders from 1997 to now. So I think I'm just interested in the 1997 figures quickly if I go up to the top, because historically Blair got elected by a landslide. And I think if you have a look in the Blair column about leader satisfaction during most of the first year of his premiership, it's at 72% there. 72, 70, 65, 75 in September. Those are massive satisfaction figures that show that, this is a snapshot of the entire country about what they feel about the leader. A lot of people, on all sides, you have to be appealing crossbench to get that sort of, those sort of ratings. Now scroll down to the bottom of the list where you'll get the 2019 figures.
Give me a second. Oh, wow. Yeah.
So
that's worse than Trump's numbers.
Well, yeah. So the government has 71% dissatisfaction. Theresa May has 58% dissatisfaction rating. And the real stunner in all of this lot, I think, is Corbyn has a 72% disliked rating, essentially, saying that they are not satisfied with his performance. Which, let me just quickly do some maths. What's that as a net satisfaction? Because 17% of them are, so that gives him a net satisfaction of minus 55, something ludicrous.
Yeah, that's pretty bad.
Yeah. So looking at all those figures, even Vince Cable, who's seen as the next along, is, has a 41% dissatisfied compared to 24% satisfied. So every single leader of every main party is seen as, not the leader that the people within those parties or the country wants. So if there was to be a new party, it would need to be, now's the time to do it, and it needs to be led by a universally popular figure. Now the big question is, who is that?
I mean, my concern here is that there isn't anyone I can think of off the top of my head who is an actual existing politician. My concern here is that it would be someone who is well liked but not a politician, and then we start going down the same kind of avenue of electing people like Trump because they've been on TV. And yeah, I think that's my concern with this kind of line of reasoning, but I'd like to see where you take it.
Yeah, well, no, I think that dissatisfaction with Parliament has been going on for a long time, and this is not a short-term trend. So ever since the expenses scandal that happened under Gordon Brown, people's view of politicians started to go down, and they started to be distrusted. And then for a sort of like a brief history lesson, after that, that's when the Lib Dems really started to soar in the polls, and there was one poll in particular that put them higher than Labour, saying that they would be the new second party. I think that was after the first TV debate, and Nick Clegg showed up very well. This was,
Oh yeah, he was very good at debating.
yeah, and it was seen at the time, if I can take you back to 2010, that here's a new party with a fresh approach that isn't the Labour that have guided us for the past 13 years, and it's not the Conservatives. This is somebody who has integrity, who, has been, needs to be given a chance. They want to do a lot of, they have a different way of approaching things. They were completely blameless for the recession in 2007. You can't blame them for Thatcherite policies, way back in the day, or the Labour policies that may have led to it before. So why not give these guys a try? However, 2015, as you alluded to earlier, people now have a great distrust for the Lib Dems, and the pain of the coalition and what that did to their reputation damaged it so severely that I don't think it will take generations for them to recover their image and to get rid of their coalition government handle that they've been given by some people who just dismiss them as, I voted Lib Dem once, they reneged on their promises, now I feel that's a waste of time. Do you think that's fair to say?
In summary, yes, I think that is the case. But yeah, I think it's impressive how much it seems to be focused on the Lib Dems. Like, it's impressive that if you talk to basically anyone on the street, even friends of mine who I tend to think are more kind of focused on what's actually happening as opposed to just like a hot take, as it were. There are a lot of people I know who are like, oh, I'd never trust them because they screwed us over with X, Y, or Z. X, Y, or Z, X, Y, or Z. This is an English podcast. Yeah, I would say very much so. And it's always surprising to me, especially people who are a few years younger than us. I think I was there, and I was fortunate enough that I was a student in the final year of my degree when they came in. We voted Lib Dem and turned Leamington Spa Lib Dem that year, which we never thought would happen. So it was, as I say, it was a big surge. And then there are various problems when they were in the coalition, but basically because they didn't manage to get much through of what they wanted, and all the stuff they promised is the kind of stuff they'd have to do if they were a full government, and because the Tories wouldn't let them do X, Y, and Z, then they got stuck in that position. And I think if you look back at it and actually analyse it, they didn't really do that bad of a job, but they really screwed up on the specifically on tuition fees, because they weren't able to convince. I mean, it's probably true that they got there and they saw the numbers and went, oh, actually, they might have done some maths without the full knowledge that the government had and been like, oh, actually, we can't fix this. But my general assumption has always been that they did want to stop that, but, they didn't really have the votes. There was only I can't remember the exact number. There was 30 of them, I think, within. So, they didn't have the sway to convince the Tories not to do that. And that's the problem. But then, very cleverly, well, I think it's a mixture of good PR and so on, that basically they got tarred with all of that. And then the Conservatives were able to go to a victory at the next election. Yeah, I think your analysis of what the average view of it is correct. But I think they have been judged too harshly, personally.
I would agree, and that I would totally agree that when you look at the minute, the finite detail, the little bits, that it's, history has been tough on the Lib Dems, but the main narrative and what you get from the person on the street is that can't trust them, can't vote for them again. And I always feel when it comes to voting behaviour, it sounds a bit weird, it sounds a bit Machiavellian, but it doesn't really matter what the truth is. It's what people believe about the parties. It's about the narrative. It's a narrative behind it and what drives them. So it will take a long time for the Lib Dems to recover. So essentially, that's my first point, is that now there's never been a better time for a new party to emerge who could almost fill that gap that was left by the last successful third party, that was the Lib Dems, I think. to see what they can do. So the next factor that Macron had that any new third party would have to adopt is campaigning methods. So one of the things Macron did is, they went out, knocked on doors, did in-depth surveys, and got down to the core of what people were really concerned about in France, what they wanted to do. And this sort of grassroots base is vitally important for any new political party. If you don't have the activists and the people believing in you, then it'll never get off the ground. So my thought on this is that the closest thing we've got at the moment was probably Corbyn and Momentum. They were the last really big driving force that was able to grab a party by the scruff of its neck and drag it in a direction, even when everybody else at the top was saying, no, you don't want to go in this direction. There was a groundswell of support that the top of the party ignored that took them that way. The problem is now, obviously, Momentum are part of the Labour Party, a massive two-party. They're not going to split off and become their own thing. So my suggestion for any third party that would have to, exist is probably to take some passionate Remainers and take those bases of support and use that as a campaigning tool. I think if you had a political party that was just for Remainers and took all of that political energy and it wasn't split between some of the Conservatives, some of Labour and all of the Lib Dems, if that could merge, then that would be sort of like a viable positive force and a viable sort of like grassroots campaigning centre that they could like take that message and run with it. The other thing, so there's two more things just with the Macron point very briefly, and I'll just skip over those. So the last one is that Macron had a very positive message and would be quite like hopeful for the future. I think a lot of the campaigning at the moment is quite negative, and people are staying in their tribes because they just think, oh, I'm glad I might not like everything that Theresa May does, but I'm glad that she's not Jeremy Corbyn, because he's so far away from my views, and vice versa.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely have how you see people talking, and they're like, how could you possibly believe in Corbyn, and it ties into some of the stuff we've seen before and talked about before. But, people say, oh, he's anti-Semitic because he's not done enough in the Labour Party to deal with anti-Semitism. They say he's got links to these terrorist groups, etc., etc. And then on the flip side, you have the people who never vote Conservative because Tory scum, things like this that they will say. So those are the two kind of narratives you get, and they are inherently polarizing when you're like, well, you're on this side or the other.
So I think any new political party would have to get away from that polarizing narrative, that negative, thank goodness we're not one of the other guys. They would just have to do no, we're going to take Britain in a new direction, have a positive future. And again, as I've alluded to, that might be one where they remain the EU, or at least come up with a different plan for staying in the EU that's much softer than what's currently proposed. The final point I wanted to add to this, at least on the Macron section, is that it's worth saying that even though Macron was able to have a great success in France and sweep to power quite unexpectedly, the French political system is very unique in the fact that it gave someone like Macron the chance. So he didn't need to come first. He didn't need a direct majority in the first round. He only needed to get around about 20% of the vote. And the rest of the vote was so split between the other parties who entered the presidential that he became one of the top two candidates. Once that happened, he was against Marine Le Pen in the final, who was very right-wing and very polarizing, so it made a lot of sense that a lot of people from the left, the centre-left, and the centre-right would gravitate towards him rather than Le Pen. In Great Britain, as I'm sure you've alluded to, there's way more factors that stop a third party from being successful or have a realistic chance of taking power. Even at the height of their powers, the Lib Dems, who I've said are probably the most successful third party, or have polled the highest, where they had about 30-odd%, I think, in the 2010 general election. They lost out on seats massively because their vote was spread throughout the country. They didn't have those old bases of support. They could never feasibly get together enough people to create a government. And even though it's entirely possible for them to do so, it's very, very unlikely because the intrinsic kind of benefits of the two-party system are still in place for Labour and the Conservatives. So, yeah, I don't know if you've got anything to add on that point or anything that you'd like to point out about how.
Not really. I mean, I think it is interesting to analyse these differences between the political systems, and I mean, the US has always felt more polarised because they essentially have a two-party system, and we always felt like we had a third choice of the Lib Dems until recently, even though they weren't necessarily going to win. Like, I feel like it seemed like you get a larger percentage of people voting for a third party. It's not like in America where it's one or the other. As you say, France takes that even further, whereby there is this kind of very egalitarian playing field at the start because they have the two elections with the runoff. So, well, they can have two elections, can't they? I think it's possible to win in the first round, but you have to get a lot of the votes.
Yeah, you'd have to get over 50%, and with a lot of... They're always looking for an absolute majority. So it's very, very unlikely that one party would be able to get over 50% with 10 parties running.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, I think there's some stuff to be learnt from the French system. Mm-hmm. But maybe is that what we're going to go into now, or are we going to be talking more about what this hypothetical third party would look like?
I want to look more. I want to look more about what this third party would look like, and if we feel that it's sort of like realistic from what we've got, and if we think that the outlines that we've given for success, is that possible with the current crop or the way that politics is going within the UK? So, for example, I've already sort of asked, like, who would be in it? Who do you think would be in it? Who do you think is like the most likely coalition to come together and form a third party?
So I think right now there are enough people annoyed with the main party's take on Brexit that you can get kind of the equivalent of the backbenchers from every party who I think if we're going for this kind of more centrist third party, we're looking at, we're not going to be grabbing the Brexiteers from the Conservative Party or from Labour. We're talking about the kind of the Remain MPs who have got annoyed at their individual parties are probably who I would see. And I think there would be a trend for them probably to be more left wing, but not necessarily fully left within Labour. They might be kind of more centrist. And I think if you're going to offer a third option, you kind of have to go with the middle way. You have to be grabbing those votes from both of the main parties now, and sit in the middle-ish. You could be slightly right or slightly left of the middle, but you need to be vaguely in the middle to kind of grab people from both sides. And I think it will have to have a lot of young people and kind of grassroots activism, because we saw how effective that was for Corbyn. And now the problem is Corbyn's been there for a while and had chances to do stuff and then not necessarily done stuff. And that's why people criticise him. So I think, yeah, having that mix, if people are too old, they've already got enough. Well, within politics, they say a week is a long time in politics, but if you're in your 50s or 60s and you're a politician and you've been a lifetime politician or a politician for a long time, there's a lot of scandal could have got linked to you. Maybe you weren't in the expenses scandal or whatever, but there's stuff that could have happened. And there are some decent politicians out there, but just the chances are higher. So that there might be a few kind of key figurehead, kind of older, maybe they were a Lib Dem MP at some point or a Lib Dem councillor, would work. But I feel, yeah, mostly we're looking at younger people. Maybe, you don't... People won't vote for someone who's like 20 most of the time because they're like, oh, they haven't had enough life experience. But, you could see people in their mid-30s who have had a successful business or something like that. And so people go, oh, well, they're trustworthy. They've done some things, but aren't as old as the kind of... Because in general, politicians are relatively old as far as the population goes, because there is this bias towards people being trustworthy, and so on. So, yeah, I think, younger kind of activist people and the edges of the other parties kind of amalgamated.
Do you think that any leading figure should have been in like any government or had any been part of a cabinet or a shadow cabinet, or do you feel that that's too close to being a politician, or too close to somebody who's voted on something in the past that may have stained their record and made them unpopular amongst this group?
I think that's the thing. I think you have to be very careful if you've got existing politicians, but I think there are decent politicians out there who you could, if they're voting voting record, for example, has been pretty good, and they've never had scandal. I wouldn't rule it out, and I think there is a benefit to being like, hey, we've got a few people who know what they're doing, because that helps assuage. Because I definitely think there is a fear of voting in people who don't know what they're doing, because people always say, oh, the government don't know what they're doing. So I think there's a benefit of having the experience there, but maybe those people aren't front and center during the campaigns.
Okay. So our party is made up of a mishmash of people from Labour, the Conservatives, and the Lib Dems, or are the Lib Dems entirely amalgamated into this party? Do you feel if it's going to be a success, if we're creating the most successful third party imaginable?
I think if you're saying it's the most successful, you have to be you would literally be picking every individual member who joins. So you wouldn't say I'm taking wholesale all the Lib Dems, because there's going to be one Lib Dem who's annoyed someone for something. There's going to be people. I mean, our local MP was involved in the coalition, so I imagine there are people who wouldn't vote for him because he was involved in the coalition, for example. So yeah, I think there definitely is. You'd have to. But if you're trying to aim for this absolute perfect hypothetical party, you have to be very stringent on who you're picking and like throw away anyone who has any issues associated with them. I sound like I'm some kind of evil PR firm now.
No, that's fine. We're just playing like it's fun to play politics and like do like these hypothetical scenarios. So don't feel free to pick your dream team, as it were, or put reality to the side once. So we've talked about like what ideological space do you think it will hold? What do you think is the vacuum in British politics that it can fill? I know we've already talked about Remain, but is there anything else on top of that you think a successful third party would stand for?
I mean, I think what the Lib Dems stand for in general is a good third party position. It's centrally located between the two other parties. I don't think we can go for something more polarizing. That's just not going to work. I mean, if anything, having a more polarizing party like we had with UKIP forces the other parties to polarize a bit to kind of grab those votes. So we want something central that's like, look, we're different from those guys. And there's always going to be a bit, no matter where you end up on the spectrum, the political spectrum, people are always going to be able to say you're a bit like them, you're a bit like that, and you get opponents. But I think, yeah, you have to go pretty central, and you have to probably be left-ish on societal issues, and you want to be a bit right-ish on economic issues, because that seems to be the winning formula for kind of centrist parties. So you don't. That there's a lot of people on the left are very, and also, as we say, activist people are very pro, green energy, things like that, and LGBT rights and all of that you traditionally see as left liberal kind of society policies. But then people are all like, nah, but we're not sure we can trust Labour with the money, So I think that is the general feeling that people have. So you want to go for that line in the middle. So you want, which is essentially what the Lib Dems are. They are slightly righter than Labour on the social issues, but generally, actually, a lot of the social issues they're quite left on, and then they're a bit more economically sensible. Some people would say. That's up for debate, and I know some people are very left wing on economic issues as well. But I think there is when people complain about Labour, they tend to say, or at least traditionally pre-Brexit and Corbyn now, people would always be like, oh, they fritter away the money, etc. And the Conservatives are very good with money. So you want to try and get that vibe to convince those people who might normally vote Conservative to vote for your centrist party.
So what you're describing to me at the moment is essentially New Labour. So
there is a bit of New Labour to it. Yeah, I mean, I can see that.
Yeah, I think it. And what I'm saying is, New Labour, when it came along in 1997, was the Manchester United of politics. It was just winning everything left, right, and centre, and it was meant to stay with us for years and years and years. And it did, but I think it's fair to say there was quite a big backlash by the end. And particularly, there's a reason why the Labour Party have now rejected that method, or they're certainly not going down the same line economically. I would argue that they've moved quite heavily to the left. So do you feel that the desire for a third party is just people sort of like pining for, going back to New Labour again? Or do you feel that there's something in that idea where you can go, no, this isn't New Labour, this is better. We're different enough from the other parties. We're different enough from that approach that worked in 1997 to update it for like 2019.
Maybe I'm wrong, but I think a lot of the problem people have with New Labour is that they felt that Labour went New Labour, and like when you see the kind of the split in the Labour Party, it's kind of between the New Labour old guard and the kind of very old guard who are now the new guard under Corbyn. And I don't know. I feel you could probably put in place a New Labour-like party that would not, if it didn't have the baggage of New Labour. I think that's the thing. Like, normally a lot of this is talking, it's personality politics as opposed to talking about policies. So I think if you came along and said, "Oh, and like, as long as you can somehow avoid being tarred with that New Labour brush," I think you could probably still convince people of the same thing. But yeah, I mean, like. Yeah, I mean, I feel like if you're sitting in that middle spot, you kind of need to fill those two things. You need to be, because those are the two big criticisms of the two parties. Tend to be the Conservatives are not socially liberal enough, and the Labour is not fiscally responsible enough. Whether or not those actually hold any real weight, it is another discussion. But like, especially with like the fiscal conservatism. There's a lot of things I would like to take issue with, but yeah, there are those are the general feelings you get from people. I think.
I think my final point will be that we've based this entire argument around. I think that them being a party that supports Remain. Is that fair to say that?
Yeah, I think so. But then that's because I would like someone to be pro Remain. So I suppose that probably biases my view on it. Maybe it would be interesting to ask someone who is not like an arch Brexiteer, but is supportive of Brexit, what they would look for in a third party. And I'd be interested to see how similar their answer was, with the exception of whether they Remain or Brexit.
Yeah, that was my one big point, because we've been talking about like a unifying person or a unifying idea. So we think that politics is very divisive at the moment, and you want somebody to bring the country together. Remain leave is still a very divisive conversation, even if it is 52 to 48, whatever way it is. You're still going to split the country down the middle with that, even though we feel that there's a large majority of the not a majority, that's wrong, a large proportion of the country that feels underrepresented when you've got the two main political parties supporting leave. There's quite a lot of people who feel disenfranchised. That doesn't necessarily mean that a party that brings sort of like Remain as their key, as their sole purpose, will be one that unifies. So I guess my point is, and I'm making it clear that a lot of people come to me and say what we really need is a third party to sort everything out and and do all these things. But what I've heard is that everybody's got a different idea of what that third party is. And a lot of people basically say, I want a third party that represents everything I believe. But it's not necessarily the same as what somebody else believes. Do you get me? Like, they're all looking for a party that perfectly matches up with them because they've got problems with the other two, but that party simply doesn't exist.
I think generally I don't think necessarily a third party in and of itself is the solution to fixing our kind of polarizing politics. I think, as we touched on our voting episode, it is a reform of how we vote that means that a two-party system is less viable, and you end up with more of a coalition kind of style thing like they have in Germany, like general coalitions where people actually have to talk to people over the aisle and not just shout at them and go until someone shouts order at them. I don't necessarily think a third party is the solution. Lots of different parties representing various things and having votes. So like as I say, the Greens are generally seen as quite weak in the UK, but in Germany and other European countries where they have different voting systems, the Greens do quite well because people do care about the environment. But when your choice is vote for them or vote for, but I've got to stop the other guy. That's the problem with the polarizing politics. The polarization in politics is that I have to do this to stop the other guy, and so more and more votes get piled into the two piles, and we ignore the stuff in the middle that's also useful, and we get very very stuck on specific things of the issues. So yes, do we want a third party? We're not sure. And we'll move on into our quick polls update. Ooh, I mean, That's interesting. The last two, I mean, so it's still, the Conservatives are still trending downwards, and Labour are also still trending downwards as we get further into 2019, which is interesting. Like, they're still very close, but the last two polls, which are about a week out of date, no, there is a tie, sorry, the most recent poll. There are two Conservative +7 polls. But then before that, there are 3 Labour polls in January. So is that related to, like, do you think that Labour surge there is because Corbyn actually put in a vote of no confidence, and then since that's kind of failed, people are going back to the Conservatives? I'm not really sure what to make of this.
Yeah, no, it's slightly bizarre that the Conservatives have taken that much of a lead. It's worth having a look at the polling companies who did it. So, as I will always say with these polls, follow the trend, not the individual outlier. So YouGov have been consistently putting the Conservatives ahead, so +5 on the 14th of Jan and then +7 in their latest one. Maybe the more worrying for Labour is the Opinion one, which on the 18th of January had them at +3, but on the 1st of February had the Conservatives on +7, so that's a swing of 10% for the Conservatives, which is massive. I think it reflects some of the worries that Labour Party supporters have had with Corbyn's approach at the moment. They feel that everything he's done maybe hasn't been as effective in either stopping the government or helping secure a orderly Brexit. I know that there are a few who accused him of playing politics. I think that was particularly amongst the right, sort of saying that the vote of no confidence essentially wasted people's time. And, when we said on that podcast, didn't we, just after Theresa May had lost, I said the next thing that's going to happen is they're going to have a vote of no confidence, but Theresa May will win it because the maths aren't there in Parliament. We all knew it, but it went ahead anyway. And as people are starting to see Labour's position on Brexit being less clear, particularly near the start of the month, then they've suffered these sort of figures in the polls. We've had no polls out since Corbyn's put that letter in, and I'd be really interested to see if they rebalance again and go back to the pattern of, Labour and Conservatives being neck and neck. The only other thing that's maybe worth pointing out is the UKIP one keeps going up and down, although I did see a big spike in the opinion poll up to 7 there for UKIP. Might just be a little sign that there's a growing amount of people who I touched on last time who are just sort of like, oh, I just want Brexit over and done with, I'm for no deal. And they're quite adamant that they want a no deal, even though all the bad stuff that comes with it. As they become more vocal, then the UKIP vote will rise slightly, but it's not even.
But I mean, if you look back to say September, it is like the UKIP was higher over summer,
yeah,
and then have dipped down, so they haven't yet recovered that amount there. Similarly, the Lib Dems had a bit of a peak in early September, and they're kind of steady now.
So the general trend is that they're staying relatively calm, but as things get more unpredictable, as no deal approaches, we could see these numbers do some quite harsh jumps either way.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting.
Yeah, I think the big question will be how the polls look after the 29th of March. Those will be the real ones to look out for.
Yeah, I mean, it's getting worryingly close every time. It's, we get 2 weeks closer every time we release one of these episodes, and it's just closer. Hopefully everything will be fine. Fingers crossed. We'll see what happens. Okay, so yeah, thank you as always for joining me, Rob.
That's all right. No problem.
It's been good. Always nice to have some listeners in the chat as well. So if you want to come and join us, there is a link to the Discord server in our show notes. You can also find us on Twitter at Unpar Podcast. You can find us on Facebook as Unparliamentary Language. You can find us on Reddit at /r/unparliamentary. And of course, you can find us on our website at parliamentary.observer. Come along and chat with us either on Discord or, comments on the website, on the Facebook page. I think Rob tends to be more active on the Facebook page and maybe also on Discord, whereas I tend to be the only person on Reddit. So, come along and chat with us. And obviously, probably the most useful thing is if you're going to be there when we're actually recording, and we can have like live feedback. But whatever floats your boat. come and join us, and we're going to be here up until we fall off a horrible cliff edge in March, at least. We'll see where we go from there. We won't have internet or electricity. Sorry to end on a bit of a downer. I'm just getting a bit worried about Brexit now. I don't know about you. Let us know.
More cans and more toilet paper were added to the shopping list. That's the levels we've got to now.
Yeah. I mean, I fortunately I quite like beans and mushrooms and other things that I can obtain in cans, tomatoes, and dried pasta. Actually, you could go quite Italian. It's just you just have to ignore the meat, I suppose. But we'll see what happens. Hopefully, it's not going to all be doom and gloom. So thank you as always for joining me, and I think it's good night from me.
And it's a good night from him.
Bye.
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 Bye.